October 1415, northern France. King Henry V of England had a problem. He had crossed the English Channel 2 months earlier with 11,000 soldiers, full of ambition and the intention of claiming the French crown. He had captured one town, Harfleur, and lost nearly half his army doing it. Disease had torn through his ranks. Men were dying of dysentery faster than they were dying in battle. He made the decision to march northeast to Calais, reach the English fleet, and sail home. Cut his losses. Survive. But the French had other ideas. A French army had positioned itself directly in his path near a small village called Agincourt. And it was not just any French army. It was the assembled nobility of France. Knights in gleaming plate armor, mounted cavalry on war horses, the most elite fighting force in Europe, outnumbering Henry's sick, exhausted survivors by at least 3-1. Henry V was 27 years old. His men had been marching for weeks. They were starving, diseased, and trapped. The French planned to destroy them in the morning. The French army at Agincourt was extraordinary, and it knew it. France had assembled between 20 and 30,000 soldiers. Among them were the greatest knights and nobles in the kingdom, men who had spent their entire lives training for exactly this kind of battle. They wore the finest armor money could produce. Their horses were war horses, bred for combat. Their weapons were the best in Europe. French military culture in 1415 was built around one central idea. The mounted knight was the supreme weapon of war. Heavy cavalry in full-plate armor, charging at full speed across open ground, was considered virtually unstoppable. It had been the dominant force in European warfare for 3 centuries. The French commanders looked at Henry's exhausted army, roughly 6,000 longbowmen and fewer than 1,000 men-at-arms, and saw something that barely qualified as an obstacle. One French nobleman reportedly said the English were so few and so feeble that they deserved only pity. He was not wrong about the numbers. He was completely wrong about what those numbers meant. Henry V did not panic. He chose his ground with the precision of a man who had thought carefully about what he had and what the enemy did not. The battlefield at Agincourt was a narrow corridor of open land, roughly 1,000 yards wide, pressed on both sides by dense woodland. Those woods were the key to everything. In an open field, 25,000 French soldiers could spread out and use their numerical advantage to surround and overwhelm any opponent. But in a corridor 1,000 yards wide flanked by trees, they could only advance in a compressed mass. The wider army was trapped in the same narrow space as the smaller one. Henry also noticed something else. It had been raining for days. The field between the two armies was freshly plowed farmland, soft, waterlogged, ankle-deep in mud that sucked at boots and hooves alike. Plate armor, the pride of French knighthood, weighed between 40 and 60 pounds per man. Men-at-arms who had to wade through churned mud in that armor would arrive at the English line exhausted, barely able to lift their weapons. Henry positioned his longbowmen in wedge formations along the edges of the woodland and ordered them to drive pointed wooden stakes into the ground in front of them, a fence of sharpened wood angled outward toward the French cavalry. Then, he waited. On the morning of October 25, 1415, St. Crispin's Day, the two armies faced each other across the muddy field. The French did not attack immediately. They outnumbered the English enormously. Time was on their side. They could wait until Henry's diseased, hungry men weakened further, or until he made a desperate move that left him exposed. Henry could not afford to wait. His men were starving. Every hour without food or water cost him soldiers who were already near their limit. So he made a decision that looked like madness. He ordered his army to advance. 6,000 longbowmen and fewer than 1,000 men-at-arms walked forward across the mud toward the largest cavalry force in Europe, stopped just outside the range of French crossbows, redrove their defensive stakes into the new ground, and opened fire. The longbow was not a weapon the French fully respected. They had faced it before. It was a peasant's weapon. Knights in full plate armor were not supposed to fear arrows, and truthfully, the arrows alone are not what killed them. What the arrows did was something more important than piercing armor. They forced the French to move, and move badly. English longbowmen could fire 10 to 12 arrows per minute at up to 250 yards. 6,000 of them firing simultaneously produced a volume of arrows the French had never experienced. The sky darkened. The sound was like thunder. Horses screamed and bolted. Formations broke. Knights who had been ordered to advance in careful, disciplined lines were now running, individually without coordination, straight into the corridor of mud and stakes Henry had spent the morning preparing. The arrow storm did not destroy the French army. It pushed them into the conditions that did. The French knights who survived the arrow storm pressed forward on foot. This is where Agincourt became something else entirely. Not a battle of tactics or weapons, but a battle against physics. 25,000 men trying to advance through ankle-deep mud in 60 pounds of armor, compressed into a 1,000-yard corridor with arrows raining down from both sides. Men in the front ranks slowed and stumbled. Men behind them kept pushing forward, not knowing what lay ahead. The formations compressed further. Men who fell could not get up. The weight of their armor made it impossible. Men behind them stepped on them. The French army was not defeated by English swords. It was crushed by its own mass, its own armor, and its own mud. By the time the surviving knights reached the English line, they could barely raise their arms. Henry's lightly equipped longbowmen dropped their bows, picked up swords, axes, and warhammers, and moved forward into the staggering French mass. The killing was methodical and brutal. Knights worth enormous ransoms were struck down in the mud because there was no time and no space to take prisoners. Henry, facing a counterattack from the French rear, gave the order to kill the prisoners already taken, a decision that horrified even his own men, but reflected the desperate reality of the moment. When the battle ended, in perhaps 3 hours, possibly less, the count began. French dead, somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000, including the Constable of France, 3 dukes, 90 counts, and over 1,500 knights. The entire leadership of French military nobility lay dead in a muddy field in Normandy. English dead, approximately 400. 400 against 6,000 on a battlefield where the French outnumbered them 3 to 1. Those numbers were so extreme that chroniclers at the time struggled to explain them. Modern historians have debated them for centuries, but the core ratio, a catastrophic French defeat by a vastly smaller English force, is not disputed. Henry V arrived at Agincourt sick, starving, trapped, and outnumbered. He left it as the most celebrated military commander in Europe. Agincourt was not a miracle. It was a lesson that France had been refusing to learn for decades. French military culture in 1415 still believed that the armored knight on horseback was the supreme expression of warfare. Knights were the nobility. Knights were the warriors. Infantry, foot soldiers, archers, commoners were support. They were not supposed to decide battles. The English longbow had proven this wrong at Crécy in 1346. It had proven it again at Poitiers in 1356, and now at Agincourt in 1415 it proved it a third time, with interest. Henry understood something the French commanders could not bring themselves to accept. The terrain, not the army, controlled what tactics were possible. The weapon that could kill at 250 yards was more dangerous than the weapon that required closing to arm's length, and the soldier who could move freely through mud was more effective than the soldier in armor who could not. He did not win because he was braver. He won because he saw the battlefield clearly, and the French saw only what they expected to see, another English army to be brushed aside. Agincourt broke France. Not immediately. The 100 Years' War continued for another 38 years, but the battle destroyed an entire generation of French military leadership in a single morning. The nobility who would have commanded French armies for the next 2 decades lay dead in the mud at Agincourt. Henry V pressed his advantage. Within 5 years, he had conquered Normandy and marched on Paris. Under the Treaty of Troyes in 2020, the French king recognized Henry V as his heir. The King of England was to inherit the Kingdom of France. Henry V died 2 years later at 35, before he could claim the prize Agincourt made possible. But the impact of the battle on military history outlasted him by centuries. The longbow became the symbol of a deeper truth that Agincourt demonstrated more clearly than any battle before it, that numbers alone decide nothing, that terrain, technology, and the willingness to see the battlefield as it actually is, rather than as tradition says it should be, decides everything. The exact numbers at Agincourt are still debated. Modern historians put the French force at somewhere between 20 and 30,000, not 80,000. But the ratio, whatever the precise count, was extraordinary. A sick, outnumbered, retreating English army had shattered the assembled flower of French knighthood in a single morning, not because of the longbow, not because of Henry's courage, but because Henry understood the battlefield he was standing on, and the French understood only the battlefield they expected. A few thousand soldiers who saw clearly beat tens of thousands who did not. The mud remembered all of it.